Leaders of the G8 are meeting for a summit in L'Aquila today in Italy. They'll talk about many issues, but we often associate these summits with progress or lack of progress in the help being provided to the world's very poorest countries. Let's discuss what the G8 can do for the world's poor. Dambisa Moyo is an economist who was born in Zambia, and Paul Collier is Professor of Economics at Oxford University. He's author of what is one of the most influential books on development in many years, a book called The Bottom Billion. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with the subject of aid and where you both are, at least, on thinking about aid and whether what the world's poor need is a package of much larger amounts of aid. Dambisa Moyo, what's your take on aid?
Well, first of all, it's Dambisa.
I'm so
but
sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
so sorry.
Don't worry. I think it's very important for us to clarify what the different types of aid are first. I mean, in my book, Dead Aid, I talk about a range of different types of interventions. There's emergency aid, where I think there's a moral imperative, and I don't think there's much debate there. I think it's important for a global community to act when we do see floods and so on, or some atrocities.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's also what I would call NGO or charitable aid, which is relatively small beer. These are sort of transfers that you give to, send £20 for a girl to go to school in Africa, or such types of small interventions. I think these first two types of aid have significant problems, but I think the reality is that there are much larger pools of aid going to Africa, which is what my book is about, which is the third type of aid, which is the large $1 billion government-to-government flows, so bilateral aid, but also the types of flows that go from multilateral institutions such as the World Bank. And I think there are a whole host of problems associated with those types of packages. There's certainly been billions of dollars going to Africa, for example, over the past 40, 50 years in many different types of ways towards infrastructure, towards democracy, structural adjustment, and so on. But I think fundamentally we are at a time where, given the financial constraints around the world, but also given the ongoing challenges and the sort of poor results that we've seen across the continent, I think it's critically important for us to think about innovating away from an aid-based system.
All right, and I should say your book is called Dead Aid.
That's right.
And Paul Collier, your book analyzes the causes of poverty in countries, but what's your view of aid and how useful it can be?
I think aid is part of the solution, not part of the problem. But I think it's a sideshow, really. There are a lot of other policies that the G8 could be thinking about, which would do more good.
Well, let's go through those policies. Paul Collier, give us some of the positive argument. If you're both a little sceptical or very sceptical about some of the aid programs, what should we be doing?
At the moment, the G8 is talking about the world food crisis of last year and how to avoid repeating it. That's a really good thing for the G8 to talk about. But their solution is basically to shift aid from one pot to another towards help for agriculture in Africa. The world food crisis last year was caused not by a failure of food supply in Africa, but by a global failure. And the global failure of supply was because a third of American grain production was diverted into biofuels. And that was crazy. And the other long-term reason for a failure of world food supply was because Europe has banned genetic modification, and that's cut European food output. And so if America and Europe really wanted to avoid a repetition of the global food crisis, America should give up on its crazy subsidies for biofuel, and Europe should lift its crazy ban on GM.
That would be more useful in your view than hitting the 0.7% target of national income that should be devoted to aid?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's a very interesting revelation. Dambisa Moyo, give us your suggestion then for a G8 policy action. Paul Collier's been very clear there about his. What would be your recommendation for policy other than aid?
Well, I think first of all, we need to ask the question, whose responsibility is it to provide public goods, such as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security? Ultimately, we should be aspiring for a situation where African societies demand of their governments that these goods are provided by African governments. So clearly there are financial constraints, which is why the argument for aid has been made over the past several decades. My argument in the book is that the type of aid that where we've seen it work in cases of Marshall Plan, for example, I believe tends to work when there is a finite policy. In other words, when we know that there's a clear exit strategy and that countries will not be dependent on aid forever. The problem with the current discourse surrounding the contribution of aids to Africa's development is that it's an open-ended commitment. There is no discussion going on right now about African governments building their tax bases and meaningfully altering policies such as a trade policy or investment policy. So the focus has gone on to education, providing money for education and healthcare, which is not useful.
We need to leave it there. Dambisa Moyo and Paul Collier, thank you both.